Welcome to the Tank Podcast. This week's episode consists of part 2 of the conversation between Anton and Bryan Karetnyk, literary translators extraordinaire.
I so admire you as another translator for not simplifying the language and not breaking down the language and not chopping up all of these sentences and very long paragraphs into shorter sentences. I think because there's something that he's doing where he wants the sentences to be long. He wants to seduce the reader. He wants us to be so caught up in reading, because when you write in longer sentences, you tend to read faster. It's a counterintuitive fact of how reading works, that shorter sentences you read slower, but longer sentences make your increases your reading speed. So I feel like he's also trying to seduce the reader and try to pull a defeat over the reader by these long sentences. And it's this form is so important, and a lesser translator would have been totally just tempted to chop everything off into simpler. It's that's easy to read. And I thought, was there any kind of deliberation you went through in making that particular decision? I'm kind of asking as a translator committing industrial espionage right now. What was your thought process behind that?
You're a man after my own heart for responding to it in that way, because that's exactly sort of what I felt about it. I mean, it comes down to, it's interesting because we always talk about our authors, but then when it comes to sort of being a translator and thinking about the readership, I don't know that the point where I start thinking, I never really think about the reader when I'm translating. It's always when it comes to the editorial stage afterwards, when your sort of decisions as a translator are being challenged, that it makes you sort of think, well, who do I want to read this, or what do I want, who is my ideal reader for this, or who would the author's ideal reader be? And I feel so strongly about not dumbing down or pandering to this sort of imagined idea of what the average reader is, because I think not always, but I've certainly had the sort of requests from editors. Oh, could we not chop this? Could we not change this? Oh, I don't know if the reader will know what this word means. Oh, could we take out the French and put English in and things like that? And I think no. I mean, all this is there in the original, and as you say, I mean, with Felsen, the length of the sentences alone is just so intrinsic to his style. If you try to chop it up, it would be a completely different work. It wouldn't work on any level. So it was just so important. But I mean, as a much more broader point, as a translator, I feel like you want to write, or you want to, if you do think about a reader ever, then you want to read for the most receptive, responsive, intelligent reader that you have. You don't want to try and sort of make it more palatable or sanitize it in any sort of way, because you lose so much. You lose so much if you try and do that. And I think, as far as I have any sort of ideological conviction in translation, that's really one of the ones that I try to hold on to strongly, because you want to capture that complexity and you want to challenge readers. Surely, I think your writing does that. Your writing does that as well.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I love that response. It's I wrote an essay called "The Mythical English Reader" for this anthology called Violet Phenomena, out from Tilted Axis Press. And I talked about this English reader that this doesn't really happen now, but in the beginning of my career, I would always be told oh, the English reader is not going to get this. Oh, the English reader needs this explained, and I'd be like, well, who is this English reader? I read English. I'm an English reader. Why doesn't what I say and what I think count? And yeah, so this is very, very heartening to hear that that this is kind of the process that you went through, because yeah, as a reader of this book, I thank you for.
I just wanted to answer. I mean, one thing that I've been really curious to ask you about, because as someone who's personally spent a lot of time working with dead authors, I mean, almost exclusively working with dead authors, you always have this fantasy about how wonderful it would be to work with a living author. But I've heard you speak in previous interviews about how, interestingly, Bora Chung, I think, is one of the few authors who you have you speak to quite a lot, or you have this very close personal relationship with, but you've actually been quite categorical about some of the other ones. You don't want to write to them. So could you tell me a bit more about that? Because I find that a really interesting sort of approach and quite counterintuitive in some sort of ways, at least for someone from my angle.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. So I again, so many people ask me this question. So do you talk to Sang-Young Park? Like how many questions about the text did you ask? Section, et cetera, et cetera. And I always tell them I almost never talk to my authors. There are authors that I've literally never talked to. I Want to Die, But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki, written by Pexei. She's a very cool person, but I have never talked to her, not even on email. And Hwang Seok-young, I have never talked to him, although I translated his entire, how many words was it, 200,000 words? Like his entire autobiography. And so, because I feel like with my authors, I have to really feel like I viscerally understand this author in order for me to translate them. And I feel like if I have a lukewarm understanding of a work, then that work is probably not for me. Yeah. And especially now that I've come to a place in my career where I can be more choosy about who I want to translate. On the other hand, I'm quite well trained as a reader, and quite well educated as a reader. And so I feel like I understand what most writers are going for and what they were doing. So I don't really have a question for them. And all of the writers that I've worked with are so good at their job that, I can clearly see, oh, you meant this to be ambiguous. You meant this to be working on this level and on that level. I can see what they're doing. So I feel like, it's very controversial as to does education matter for translators? And I kind of fall on the side where not everyone should get an MFA in literary translation. I don't have an MFA, but not everyone should get one. But some kind of education that you get somehow, somewhere, I think is really, really important, because the translators kind of have to understand literature at a level where most readers really don't. The Japanese translator Sam Bett, he said this really cool thing at an event that we were in together, where he said translators are the slowest readers in the world. And yeah, translating something is to read something extremely slowly, and you kind of see things at that speed that most readers don't see. And I feel like, yeah, that's how I'm going to explain it from now on. I kind of stole that stamp. Yeah, so, and the other thing about dead authors, I have translated a dead author, Kang Young-ae, and the book is called The Underground Village, and it's also published by On Third Star. And she's long dead. And part of my justification for translating her was that my maternal side of my family came down from North Korea during the beginning of the Korean War. And so their cadence is very different from South Koreans. North Koreans speak much more combatively, and they're much sharper tongued than people in the southern part of the peninsula. And so my mom, me, whenever we speak Korean, we're always accused of being mean. And I'm just like, no, this is just how people talk up there. But yeah, so I think I was like, I understand where she's coming from, because she was also born in North Korea, although I believe she spent most of her working life in Manchuria. And so I kind of wanted to, when triangulating her voice, I was like, okay, she has to sound like my mother. She has to sound like some English writer who has a very sharp and clear tone. And that's why I thought of Pearl Buck. And she also kind of has to sound like me, because I feel like English-speaking North Korean, what would a North Korean sound like if they spoke English? I'm like, probably like me, frankly. And so I was like, I'm going to triangulate her voice around here. So there was a bit of that going on, where I did not have recordings of her voice, and I had never met her, and I didn't know what she would sound like. But that was kind of another question that I wanted to ask you. I kind of you kind of touched upon it in your previous answer, but so when I was reading this text, it kind of made me feel like when I'm reading translations of Freud, for example, people think that Freud is, I mean, he is a very early 20th century figure, but I feel like because he came of age in the Victorian era, like a lot of his thinking is very 19th century. And I think translators kind of, I can't read German, so I don't know how he writes in German, but I feel like translators pick up on it where they kind of use like a little bit more of a Victorian English when they translate him. And it is indeed those translations that I feel where I'm like, oh, I understand what is being said easier than a Freud translation that uses more contemporary voice. And I feel like the voice that you kind of like zeroed in on was kind of like, it is very modern and contemporary, but there's also like these elements of like those thick Victorian novels that we all love reading. And I was wondering, like, how did you come up with the combination that is necessary for this voice?
Gosh, that's a really interesting question. I think it kind of in a way it comes back to this. I mean, it comes back to this question. A really sort of interesting what we were talking about earlier. This idea of difficulty and this idea of sort of challenging the reader. And I think you're absolutely right. When you read these translations of Freud, actually, even though syntactically, linguistically, whatever, they might be more complex sentences, the Victorian translations that you're talking about, but they actually, there's something psychologically that works for your reader. You're able to follow the train of thought so much better than when it's sort of these attempts to sort of sanitize or I don't know, just make it slightly more regular. It's like they have. I feel that the language of that time has a much broader tolerance for strangeness or quirkiness or sort of doing things that aren't. I mean, so much of language these days has been sort of whittled down to sort of these bite-sized sort of 4 or 5 word sentences and then sort of break it and then go on and on and on. And I think it's interesting when you were talking about the previous example and how you're sort of listening for the voice of your mother and how there's these sort of family connections that you sort of imbue it with. And I think while I was working on this, I was very much minded of my grandfather's. My grandfather was Russian and Ukrainian. He was born in Ukraine, but to Russian parents before he emigrated. And there was so much of his experience in that sort of dislocation, in that sort of emigre experience that I saw in this. And I remember one of the interesting things, again thinking about it, is we don't talk about it a lot, I think, as a sort of translation community, or people who, I mean, maybe not so much for people who are bilingual, but for people who have to learn a language at a difficult age, say in adolescence. There's so much of your life that you spend being deeply uncomfortable in other languages. And that sort of element of discomfort, that element of dislocation, I thought was so important to keep. So, I mean, of course, he speaks, I mean, this is written in Russian, so he's speaking in Russian, but he's also dipping into French, and he's sort of, you have that sort of uprootedness that occurs again and again and again. And I think that's a feeling that comes through in the Russian. It's a feeling that I want to convey to the reader sometimes. It's that I want them not always to feel 100% comfortable. I think it's a healthy thing for a book to grip you and take you out of that and sort of do something unexpected. I spent much of my own life sort of being deeply uncomfortable and trying to speak other languages. I mean, not Russian, but like say French or German or these other things. And because so often people think of it as being sort of binary, you speak it or you don't, but actually the reality for 90% of people is always somewhere in the middle where you're feeling this sort of slightly more ambiguous, difficult space and actually feeling deeply uncomfortable in other languages. So, I mean, there was definitely an element of wanting to provoke the reader and to try and capture something of that. But again, I think to go back to the point of the specific voice and sort of capturing that. I mean, so much of it was there in the original. It was just a case of trying to work out how I was going to mould English to really capture that. Because, like I said at the start, it's quite an unnatural form. These very, very, very long, sinuous sentences. But once you can sort of, it's almost hypnotic. I mean, the rhythm somehow takes over, or that's how I felt when I was doing it. I mean, I would sort of translate, and you know, when you do the first draft and you're sort of bashing out and you think, my God, this is going to be absolutely awful. It's not going to make a blind bit of sense. But then actually, so often with this, I would be doing that, and then I go back and read over it. Sometimes it would be garbage, but sometimes it would be sort of transformed. I was like, oh my god, this actually makes perfect sense. And it's because it is that sort of stream of consciousness, rambling, continuous thought, but somehow there is sense still in it. So, I mean, I don't know what the balance is, whether it's 50-50, but there's definitely a part of it that's just me trying to do the sort of nuts and bolts of translation, but then there's also the alchemy that somehow magically happens throughout it. I don't quite know how to do it, but yeah, and then being aware of all these sort of other layers, like we spoke about earlier, and these other voices that you've got in your head. But yeah, I mean, trying to sort of work. I mean, for me, one of the most important things was, I think, what some readers miss, but you've already picked up on, is the idea that there's actually this gentle, well, actually not even gentle, but quite dark humour that runs throughout the work as well. I mean, he's got a quite perverse sense of humour that sort of comes across again and again. And sort of that layer of irony, that layer of humour, but then also like this layer of neuroses, because this profoundly self-reflexive novel. I mean, thinking about every action throughout your day in the most minute detail. I mean, yeah, it sort of lends itself to all of that, really, this sort of the author's style, but also like what you said earlier. I mean, this idea that the work lends itself to translation. I mean, again, like that style sort of crosses over quite well, I think. Once you can sort of work out how to handle these long, overweight sentences, then it works, I suppose.
Yeah, there's several things that you just said like totally struck me. To begin with, there's something about him just having his language, I guess Russian, like not being able to use it as much as he wants to. And it's just being so suppressed and oppressed, like in his daily life, that when he gets to his diary, he just like spills it out. He's just like, this is vomiting out this language. And that's part of like the energy that you feel from the text, because you feel a lot of energy, a lot of glee actually, and from the text, which I can totally identify with. And one of the things that I just love about this book. Like I feel like that's kind of in it, where he just wants to be able to speak in a sentence that is like very long, because presumably he goes about his day in Paris like speaking French, which I'm sure he's very good at, but kind of it will be like a second language. It will be a language that he acquired later, and where, like you said, there are some anxieties that probably surround the usage of French. It's probably extremely proper French. I think as translators, like we get, we're constantly evaluated on our language skills and whether something is translated properly or not. It's never a matter of like, do I like this book? The wonderful translator Damien Searle did an interview where he said something like, books written in English, the first thing that a reviewer asks is, did I like this book, or does this book work? Whereas for the translation, it's like, oh, they're evaluating like the language skill of the translator, and is this properly translated? Like there's a kind of like evaluation element that goes into translations, and yeah, there's definitely a lot of like anxiety around languages. So basically, you're arguably a heritage speaker of Russian, because it's a language of your family, one of the languages of your family, and like so am I. Obviously, I'm Korean. And my parents are Korean. My entire family is Korean. I live in Korea, and I would get a lot. Like I would see, for example, Korean diaspora translators who would be very kind of like defensive about their language, defensive of their Korean, and it would never occur to me to judge them for their Korean. I mean, you don't live in the country, you didn't grow up here, so why would I judge you for? I think it's great that regardless of that, you are excellent translators. So I mean, you don't really need to speak that fluently in order to be a translator. A lot of translators don't even speak their source languages, and so like there's a lot of anxiety about that. I thought another really interesting thing you said earlier was about failure, and how we're kind of like, as translators, we're always destined for failure. There's a lot of good writing about this. I forget who the writer is, but there's a book called The Queer Art of Failure, and I think it also talks about translation, where we're kind of doomed to not be able to translate the entire thing. I don't know, like to 100% convey, something that is in one language to another, because languages are different, and they talk about false cognates, but like everything is a false cognate if you really think about it. I mean, things are false cognates within the same language. I think of the word bicycle, and you think of the word bicycle, and the connotations are going to be different because we've written different bicycles. So we're just destined to fail. But then, if you think about it, so is literature. Literature is always destined to fail. Literature itself. You're not going to be able to describe something perfectly. You're not going to be able to realize that beautiful, perfect, platonic ideal of a story that is in your head in the very material language, the very profane language that that is necessary for publication. Like, that's not going to happen anyway. So I thought that in those two things, what you said, like the anxiety surrounding languages, and also like a failure, is a very big hallmark of literary translation. And at the same time, we don't really go around talking about it because we don't want people not to hire us. And we can't go around saying like, yeah, but which is all the more.
You're absolutely right, but I think it's not a bad thing at all. Like, you're not saying it is at all, but I mean, this is it's just about being open about it and sort of talking about these things that we all intrinsically feel when, or most of us do, when we're working on these things. But it's just part and parcel. But I mean, there's so much mystery sort of surrounding a lot of the processes. I mean, that was one thing I was going to ask you, actually, because I saw on Twitter the other day you've just celebrated an anniversary. I think is it 4 years since the Core Dancer came out. So I was going to ask how, like, if you think back across those 4 years, you've done a phenomenal amount of work. So how has your practice as a translator changed over that time? Or do you think it has changed? And if so, like, how do you think it's changed?
Yeah, good question. I believe I got that contract in 2017, which is the year that I switched from. I briefly worked in the tech industry, so I switched from tech to full-time literary translation in 2017, and then the book came out in 2018, my first book. Yeah. What has changed since then? I feel like the number one thing that has changed since then is not me so much, but the way people perceive me. It kind of took a while for publishing as an industry to take me seriously, for funders in Korea to take me seriously. That really didn't happen until I got longlisted for the Booker Prize this year. So it's basically, it's like 6 years of like 5 years of like, what am I doing? Like, why doesn't anyone return my calls? Like, how am I supposed to get a book to translate when no one thinks that I can do the work that I do? And so it really, I feel like my practice has gotten easier as the more that I publish. And I think that's a really, really important thing. I wrote this essay called The Emerging Translator Valley of Death, where a lot of translators, literary translators, kind of give up on literary translation in this valley of death because they can't get anything published. But I feel like the thing about translation is that your career does not go up in a linear line. Your career kind of goes up like this in an exponential line. So you are when you're down here in the valley of death in this curve, you're like, why isn't my career up here? Why is my career down here? It should be up here by now. And then you're kind of doubting yourself. And then there's this point where your expectations meet your actual career, and then your career actually goes beyond your expectations. And like for me, that point was, the getting nominated. So really, it wasn't me. It was just the industry, and also perhaps like the nature of the industry, where they kind of put you in this valley of death for some years. For me, I think it was like 8, like for 8 years, and then 10 years, I guess. then you start to see returns on your investment. But it took me longer than I thought it would. And if I were told like this was the case when I began my career, I probably would not have stuck with it. So I'm glad no one told me this in the beginning of my career. But yeah, I kind of want to tell, aspiring translators if they're watching this that maybe you are in this curve right now. And as long as you keep producing good work, you will eventually be okay. Speaking of good work, so I also saw on Twitter that you have sold another book by the same author. Can you tell us about that?
By Yuri Felsen, you mean?
Yes.
Yes. So it was brilliant. So the wonderful UK publishers, Prototype, they were the ones who took the chance on the book initially. They were fantastic about it. But again, it's sort of this question of selling the American rights for the book as well. It took a long time before we sort of thought about that, but luckily, Astra, these fantastic publishers who are doing a lot of work now, they've taken that, so it will be going to American readers very, very shortly. I think it's coming out in America and Canada in February next year. So that's all lined up, and we're already sort of hopefully thinking about doing some more Felsen in the forthcoming as well. And I think I saw you, because I remember roundabout, I found it phenomenal because around about the time that I think when Curse Bunny was listed for the Booker, you still hadn't sold the American rights either, had you? Is that right? But now you have. I think I'm right in saying that. Yeah, of course. So I mean, congratulations on that. That's fantastic. So are you doing more by Bora Chung in the future? Can you tell us?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to talk about it yet. Publishing's so weird. I'm like, why am I not allowed to talk about this? And they're like, I don't know, just don't talk about it yet. And I'm like, it's so strange to me that I'm not allowed to talk about it. But I'm going to talk about it because, what are they going to do? Like, fire me from being Bora Chung's translator? So, there will be new Bora Chung coming out next year. This book is going to be more straightforward science fiction than kind of like fantasy science fiction, speculative fiction, kind of like all mixed into one, like Curse Bunny was. So that's going to be something to look forward to. I believe and the American version, the American edition is being published, of Curse Bunny is being published by Algonquin, and that's coming out December 8th, I believe. And interestingly, the book after that is going to be Kyung Suk Shin's I Went to See My Father, which is also an Astra House book. So we're going to be publishing house friends. Mate, cousins, I don't know what you call it. And I think my book will come out 2 months after your book, so it'll be fun. And maybe we'll do another one of these things together. Yeah. On that note, I think it has been an hour.
yeah, I think we should probably pull a halt there, otherwise we'll just talk and talk.
Right. Thank you so much for doing it.
Gone to sleep by now. Oh, you are there.
No, it's not that late. It's like 7:30. Thank you so much for doing this. This is so much fun.
No, thank you. It's been such a pleasure meeting you after this time and saying hello properly. Yeah, I've really enjoyed this.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.